While we're waiting for latecomers, just have a look at the fly sheet, please. On the fly sheet, I've put every quotation that I'm going to use in the course of the lecture. And there are a lot of quotations, because what I believe about CS is that through reading the actual text, you can develop your own interpretation. And so I'm using as much of the text as possible. So you can follow the lecture by following the fly sheet. Every quotation I give is given on the fly sheet. And at the end, at the bottom of the second page, there's a little note that I've added about Athene and her relation to her mother, who was called a goddess called Metis. And Metis is, in a way, the subject of my lecture, because Athene, the goddess, and Odysseus share this quality of Metis. It's an ancient Greek word meaning, in our translation, cunning intelligence, or plan, scheme. So, with that, I'll start my lecture. For 3 years, Penelope tricked the suitors by saying she would marry one of them when she had finished weaving a piece of cloth. By day, she would weave, but by night she would undo the weaving until she was found out and forced to finish. Odysseus says to Athene at the end of Book 13, when asking her advice about how to proceed, "Come, weave the design." The word here is Metis. Penelope says to the stranger beggar, who is really Odysseus in disguise, that to put off the suitors, I, quotes, weave my own wiles. Odysseus, when he is swimming in the sea, alone, wonders, which of the immortals is weaving deception upon me? The image of weaving is much used in the Odyssey, and Homer's art is itself like weaving. This is why I've called my lecture Weaving the Design, the irony of disguise. I want to look at how Homer plays on disguise and deception. At the back of this is a notion of the Odyssey as an epic drama performed live, not read as we are doing, but sung over a number of days by a poet-singer who to some extent is free to go his own way through the story. The first point to note is that disguise is a form of namelessness, and that the whole of the epic concerns the naming and recognition of Odysseus as a hero. But there's a difference between how the theme of naming and recognition is treated in the first half of the epic and in the second. Remember that we only meet Odysseus in Book 5 on the island of Calypso, who has kept him hidden with her for 7 years. Book 5 ends with Odysseus having left Calypso, struggling onto the Phaeacians' island after swimming for his life, exhausted, naked, alone, and nameless. There's nobody else to tell the Phaeacians who he is. He cannot tell them himself, because who would believe him? The world is full of wandering nobodies, claiming to be somebody special. Somehow, starting from nothing, he has to get himself into a position where he will be acknowledged as Odysseus by the Phaeacians, honored by them with gifts, and taken home. He does this by using the quality which sets him apart as a hero, the quality of cunning intelligence or metis. During a feast, still as an unnamed stranger, he asks the Phaeacian singer Demodocus to sing the story of how Odysseus tricked the Trojans with the wooden horse. His reaction to Demodocus' story prompts the Phaeacian king to ask the stranger who he is. This is at the end of Book 8. Odysseus identifies himself. I am Laertes. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known before all men for the study of crafty designs. And he starts telling the story of his great wanderings from the time he and his companions left Troy. It's an unusual story, full of semi-human, semi-godly beings, not the kind of story about heroes or gods that people were used to. Halfway through, he pauses, and Alcinous, the Phaeacian king, comments on its unusual form. We, as we look upon you, he says, do not imagine that you are a deceptive or thievish man, making up lying stories from which no one could learn anything. You have a grace upon your words, and there is sound sense within them, and expertly, as a singer would do, you have told the story of the dismal sorrows of those who went to Troy. But come now, he goes on, tell me, and give an accurate answer. Did you see any of your godlike companions who once with you went to Troy and met their destiny? That's to say, can you give us a more normal story of heroes who died on the field of battle? And Odysseus, his audience entranced, immediately tells how he met the spirits of Agamemnon and Achilles in Hades. Homer the poet is thus constructing a new kind of epic of homecoming and the restoration of order rather than of war. And he has his hero Odysseus tell his own story, sing his own fame. So we've got three issues mixed together. One, a new kind of epic. Two, a corresponding new kind of hero who uses storytelling to further his purpose. And three, namelessness, or the process of being recognized as somebody, not nobody. Of course, the first major story he tells the Phaeacians is how he got out of the Cyclops cave by pretending to be called nobody, which is why the story is thematically so important to the whole epic. The second half of the epic plays on the theme of namelessness differently. Here, disguise is essential. What appears to be a wandering beggar, a nobody, is really the hero Odysseus in disguise. Again, the hero is landed on an island, this time his own island of Ithaca, alone, without companions to say who he is. But this time he is alone against numerous young men, the suitors, who've been pestering his wife Penelope to marry one of them. Somehow he has to manipulate himself into a position where he can control events, and by controlling events, control his own story. And he does this by using the special skill of cunning intelligence, by telling stories about what he knows of the real Odysseus. At one point, Eumaeus, the swineherd, says to Penelope, "Such stories he tells. He would charm out the dear heart within you, as when a man looks to a singer who has been given from the gods the skill with which he sings for delight to mortals. So he enchanted me in the halls as he sat beside me." And Homer himself says in Book 19, he knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings. Because the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, claims to have news of the real Odysseus, he gains an interview with his wife Penelope. There is then a very poignant part of the story when appearance and reality are very close. When Odysseus in disguise is talking about the real Odysseus to Penelope, foretelling his own imminent return. He persuades Penelope that he has a special relation with the real Odysseus, and he is invited by her to attend the feast the next day, when the suitors will compete to string Odysseus's bow and win her for wife. The second half of the epic thus goes from Odysseus as nothing to his being recognized as husband, father, hero, king, to the restoration of order in his palace, and to the revelation of truth, as opposed to all the lying stories, disguise, and deception he has had to use to gain his homecoming. The movement is from outer to inner, and recognition. Odysseus moves from the outermost part of his estate, his island, to the inner chambers of Penelope, his wife. The final recognition of Odysseus by his wife Penelope involves her testing him about the marriage bed. I'll return to disentangle some of these themes a little later, but for the moment I want to emphasize that Odysseus' skill of storytelling is part of his general ability to get the better of every situation. What in ancient Greek is called metis, translated here as cunning intelligence, design, or perfect planning. A singer is close to the gods, for he is inspired by the muse and tells of events that ordinary mortals don't know of. Similarly, the quality of metis is godlike in that it is able to pierce through the established order of things to secure an advantage. It threatens the order of gods and men. And it is for this reason that Odysseus is punished by Poseidon when he shows such incredible metis in getting out of the Cyclops' cave. Not just because Poseidon is Polyphemus' father. Homer the poet is thus putting his own skill as a singer into the picture of heroism in the Odyssey. The relation between singing and commanding events is made explicit by Homer at the key point when Odysseus in disguise, having been invited by Penelope to attend the feast, when the suitors are going to test their skill with the bow, he is given the bow after several suitors have tried to string it and failed. This is the climax up to which the second half of the epic has led, when Odysseus reveals himself and takes control. The suitors are, of course, dismissive of the beggar handling the bow. he must be a thief. Quotes, so the suitors talked. Homer says, but now, resourceful Odysseus, once he had taken up the great bow and looked it all over, as when a man who well understands the lyre and singing, easily, holding it on either side, pulls the strongly twisted cord of sheepscot so as to slip it over a new peg, so without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow. Then, plucking it in his right hand, he tested the bowstring, and it gave him back an excellent sound, like the voice of a swallow. And Zeus, showing forth his portents, thundered mightily. Odysseus then throws off his rags and says, here is a task that has been achieved without deception. And he starts killing the suitors. Now let me go back over some of the central issues. Disguise is a central element in the second half of the Odyssey, because Odysseus is alone when he gets back to Ithaca. He has to use the two qualities for which he is most famous. His cunning intelligence first, or metis, the quality for which he made himself famous in Troy when he devised the trick of the wooden horse. And secondly, the power to endure humiliation and suffering. When he visited Hades in Book 11 during his great wanderings, he heard from the blind prophet Tiresias that suitors were pestering his wife Penelope to marry one of them, and eating up all the stock of his estate. But in fairness, he should assess the situation for himself. He has heard that Penelope has been faithful to him, but should he believe hearsay? He must test the truth for himself. His son, Telemachus, will have recently come into manhood, but of his qualities, Odysseus has no experience. Can Telemachus be relied upon not to give the game away when his father is being humiliated in the palace by the suitors and by servants? Odysseus doesn't know. For these reasons, Odysseus advises him to go in disguise in order to make trial of everyone and everything. Gods also may go in disguise. It's one of the reasons you have to treat everybody well. You never know what might be behind the appearance. When one of the suitors throws a footstool at Odysseus in disguise in Book 17, others are shocked and say, you did badly to hit the unhappy vagabond. A curse on you if he turns out to be some god from heaven. For the gods do take on all sorts of transformations, appearing as strangers from elsewhere. And thus they range at large through the cities, watching to see which men keep the laws and which are violent. Behind the figure of a beggar, there may be a king or a hero. By going in disguise, Odysseus is able to make trial of the appearances of things, testing the reality behind appearances. Disguised as a wandering beggar, he can go anywhere. As a vagabond, someone who's been wandering from place to place, he's expected to have news of other places. But as a beggar who has to sing for his supper, he's expected to exaggerate and lie, not to tell the truth. Here lies the dramatic irony of the epic. Appearances have to be tested. Odysseus must go in disguise, even on his own land, in his own home. How do the servants, how do the suitors, how does his son, his father, his wife treat him when they don't know who he is? Do they treat wandering strangers nobody's properly. Moreover, in disguise as a beggar who says he has wandered afar and heard news of Odysseus, he is the bearer of truth about his own homecoming, something for which everyone is waiting, on which the whole electric situation depends. But why should a hungry beggar be believed? Penelope has become so habituated to the unpleasant reality of Odysseus' absence that her mind takes refuge in dreams, a different kind of wandering. When Odysseus finally throws off his disguise and confronts the suitors, he is the bearer of truth in another sense, that of a higher moral reality behind appearances. For he will restore the order that was upset by the suitors by the continued disorderly, violent presence. These three aspects of truth, disguise, and wandering are interwoven in the epic. The Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally means not hidden, not disguised, not forgotten. A singer in ancient Greece has the special role of not letting famous men be forgotten. And in that sense, he not only makes a hero's name immortal, he creates truth. In sound, aletheia is very close to the word for wandering in ancient Greek, aletheia. Homer makes use of the close sound of these two words, playing on where their meanings intersect. For instance, in Book 14, I've given you a long quotation from the swineherd Eumaeus, starting, "Old sir, there is none who could come here bringing a report of him and persuade his wife and dear son," and so on. You can read that for yourself. The second half of the Odyssey thus plays on the theme of wandering in a different way from the first. The first half has the returning hero wandering over the sea, calling on all manner of half-gods, nymphs, and magical beings, as well as journeying to the underworld to meet the spirits of the dead. It's a voyage that tests his powers of endurance and his cunning intelligence. Poseidon, whose realm is the sea, has caused Odysseus a lot of trouble, though he hasn't been able to prevent his homecoming, for this is ordained by the gods. But the voyage home should be seen also in the light of what is expected of a man in times of peace, who wants to build up a reputation and fame for himself and to have a successful homecoming instead of a tragic one. At the risk of going over ideas that you may already have discussed in class, I'm going to outline 6 background issues. So now I'm going to follow the fly sheet of these 6 background issues. The first of these is the nature of Odysseus' heroism. I've already said a bit about this. Odysseus had proved himself on the field of battle at Troy. The problem with the Odyssey is to demonstrate a set of qualities that enable a hero to have a successful homecoming against all difficulties, something emphasized in the first lines of the epic. A hero who dies on the field of battle makes a name for himself, which lasts forever. But what about the hero who survives? The first contrast here is with Achilles, the hero of the Iliad who died at Troy, whose spirit Odysseus meets in Hades, and whose memory Odysseus recalls when he is swimming for his life in the sea after having left Calypso. and Poseidon has sent a little storm to break up his boat. Will Odysseus die in the sea? Unknown. Far better to have died at Troy, like Achilles. Achilles himself, or Achilles' spirit in Hades, doesn't agree. He'd far prefer to be alive, even if he's a landless laborer. The other contrast in heroism is with the returned leader of the Greek expedition, Agamemnon, whose wife, Clytemnestra, did not remain faithful on his return. This is not a good example of a hero's homecoming. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was still too young to do anything about the murder at the time, and he fled. But later, he killed both his mother and her lover. And the whole story becomes a favorite topic of Greek tragedy. Agamemnon's homecoming was tragic. The contrast of Agamemnon with Odysseus, then, is not only hero with hero, but hero's wife with wife, son with son. Penelope is faithful. Clytemnestra was not. Orestes, Agamemnon's son, eventually took vengeance on his mother's lover and his mother. What is the role of Telemachus going to be, Odysseus' son? It's essential to the plot that Telemachus should just be coming into manhood at the time of Odysseus' return. It's this that makes the situation so electric, ready to boil over. At the very time when it does come to a head, when Penelope decides to set up the bow contest in order to see whom she will remarry, there Odysseus is, ready and waiting, ready to reveal himself, the truth behind the disguise. The effect of Telemachus starting to take charge of his absent father's household is twofold. One on the suitors, the other on his mother. The suitors see Telemachus as a threat to their own position, not only because he might become their king, but also because he'd spoiled the good times that they are having at his expense, and they plot to kill him. The hostility thus comes into the open, whereas previously, when Telemachus was young, they hadn't bothered about him. The effect of Telemachus coming of age on Penelope, his mother, on the other hand, is to force her to come to a decision about remarriage. As she tells one of the suitors in Book 18, Odysseus had advised her, before he left, to keep everything in her charge. But, quotes, "When you see our son grown up and bearded, then you may marry whatever man you please and leave your household." And to Odysseus himself, when he is in disguise as a beggar and she is quizzing him about news of the real Odysseus, Penelope says, "Now I cannot escape from marriage. I can no longer think of another plan." The word she uses is metis, important. "My parents are urgent with me to marry. My son is vexed as they eat away our livelihood. He sees it all. He's a grown man now, most able to care for the house." And the beggar, Odysseus in disguise, advises her not to put off the contest any longer, he said. So because Telemachus is coming of age, the situation is ripe for resolution. And in fighting with Odysseus, he shows himself to be a worthy son of his father. The third background issue is the context of gift-giving and of hospitality. Normally, in peacetime, during Homeric age, how did a person build up a reputation for himself? In 3 ways, I suggest. 1, by upholding the proper laws of Zeus in relation to hospitality. 2, by calling on people, being honored as a guest with gifts, and establishing long-term alliances, also sealed with gifts. And 3, through raiding expeditions and plunder. I won't go into any of these, except to ask you to be aware, when reading, of the special idea of a guest gift, whether it is bad, like the ones the Cyclops or nasty suitor uses, or good. Good guest gifts, sealed friendships or treaties between different kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean in Homeric times. Can anybody tell me what the Cyclops' guest gifts were to Odysseus? Yes? Good. I'm going to eat you last. The second one? At the end, when Odysseus, at first, Odysseus says he's called nobody. So the first guest gift is when he's saying, okay, I'll give you a guest gift, I'll eat nobody last. But the second is when Odysseus has named himself, and so he then calls on Poseidon to curse, to harm Odysseus. And these are, the word is, there's a special Greek word for guest gift. It's something, when one reads, one doesn't notice it at all, but it's a special concept. Okay, 4th background issue is the question of order. A hero has not only to uphold the cosmic order, but more importantly in the Odyssey, which concerns peace, not war, the social and moral order. It's this social and moral order that's been disturbed by the unruly presence of the suitors in Odysseus' palace while he's absent. And that Odysseus, on his homecoming, as revealer of the truth, reality as it should be, will restore. Apart from the abuse of Zeus's law of hospitalities, the suitors do not honor the gods properly by always pouring a libation to the gods, by sacrificing meat. And they, quotes, give way to the force and violence in themselves. It's when a person gives way to the force and violence in themselves that actions become reckless, which in turn calls for punishment. So there are 3 levels of order reflecting each other: cosmic order, social order, and personal order. The ideal of personal order is well-balanced mind, moderation. As Agamemnon's brother Menelaus tells Telemachus, in all things moderation is good. Neither excessive in hate nor excessive in friendship. Secondly, as far as social order is concerned, the head of a household maintains its order. Good leadership, in turn, leads to good government and prosperity. In the leader's absence, however, the order is liable to go to pieces. Penelope laments to Odysseus in disguise that there are none left to give orders in the household. And Eumaeus the swineherd says, when my master is gone, all order disappears. People are no longer willing to do their rightful duty. So that's the question of order. These are the more general points, background issues. But there are two others that I want to raise before going through bits of the second half in greater detail. I've already said something a little bit about putting people on trial. Odysseus has to test in person the behavior of the suitors, the loyalty of his servants, his wife, even his father. As Athene says to him in Book 13, when she has come to give him her advice about how to proceed, anyone else come home from wandering would have run off happily to see his children and wife in his halls. But it is not your pleasure to investigate and ask questions, not till you have made trial of your wife. And she praises him for this quality, which demonstrates his metis, something for which she is famous. But in addition to the idea of putting other people always to trial, not taking appearances for granted, the idea of a general contest when people are tested competitively against each other should also be mentioned. The contest of the bow marks the climax of the story, when only Odysseus is able to string the bow, and when he shoots an arrow through a line of axe heads. How the beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has been allowed to enter the contest, or at least handle the bow, after several suitors have failed, and the leader suggests postponing the contest until the following day, you must read for yourself. Both Penelope, unknowingly, and Telemachus, knowingly, have a part in this. You can imagine what the suitors must have felt if along comes a beggar and is able to string the bow. One of them says, "We are ashamed to talk. We are ashamed to face the talk of the men and the women, for fear some other might say, they are not even able to string the bow." Then another man, some beggar man, came wandering in from somewhere and easily strung the bow. That would be a disgrace to us all. Not only a disgrace, that's going to be the end. They're going to be killed. Here the play on being a wanderer and being a nobody is particularly marked. And what does Odysseus say when he is shot an arrow through the line of axe heads? Here is a task that has been achieved without any deception. The reality in the raw, the beginning of the end, when order is restored and truth is revealed. The idea of a contest, not only in athletics, but also in drama and poetry, was very important to the ancient Greeks. That's how drama originated. The second general point is simply the skill of the poet weaving his story into our hearts. When you read the second half, please do be aware of the dramatic effects Homer is using to draw the reader into the story and become emotionally involved. You have to imagine the Odyssey being recited out live. The audience knows the story. It's up to the poet to keep the audience's interest, building up to the climax, playing on words, playing on situations. This is where irony comes in, especially irony of disguise. The audience knows that the wandering beggar is Odysseus in disguise, but the people to whom the beggar is talking do not. This ironical situation is played out by Homer to the full. What happens when his faithful dog recognizes him? Will his old nurse recognize the scar that he has on his leg when she baths him? Above all, when Odysseus in disguise is talking to his wife Penelope, many of the remarks to each other have particular pathos and irony. This is now what I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail, to bring out the underlying relation between truth, appearance, and reality. The wandering beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, has already claimed to the swineherd Eumaeus that he has knowledge of the real Odysseus, whose imminent return he has prophesied. This is reported to Penelope, who naturally wants to question the man herself. Penelope summons Odysseus in disguise for an interview while the suitors are still feasting. But Odysseus tells Eumaeus, who has brought the summons, that it would be better to wait until the suitors have gone away for the night, because they're so unruly. As both Eumaeus and Penelope observe, ironically, this is a very funny beggar who refuses the opportunity of a good supper or clothes. A bashful vagabond, they say, makes a bad beggar. But Penelope agrees, and after the suitors have gone, this is now the beginning of Book 19, she descends to the hall, where there are still a few serving maids clearing up, one of whom is especially insulting to the beggar. Odysseus in disguise spins a tale to Odysseus in disguise spins a tale to Penelope about how he had entertained the real Odysseus in Crete 19 years ago, soon after the latter had left on the expedition to Troy. By claiming to be the brother of someone with whom Odysseus had a hereditary friendship, one of those special alliances I mentioned, sealed by a guest gift, and to have entertained Odysseus in his brother's absence, Odysseus in disguise is laying claim to Penelope's protection. He knew how to say many false things that were like true sayings, Homer comments, and then, as she listened, her tears ran, and her body was melted as the snow melts along the high places of the mountains, and as it melts, the rivers run full flood. It was even so that her beautiful cheeks were streaming tears as Penelope wept for her man who was sitting there beside her. This is Homer the poet, both drawing the audience into the emotion of the situation and pointing out its irony. Odysseus's eyes, Homer said, stayed steady under his lids. He hid his tears and deceived her. Now comes Penelope's first test. If you knew him when he left here 19 years ago, she says, I will give you a test. What was he wearing? Well, Odysseus says, it's a long time ago, but, and he proceeds to describe minutely the special clasp that he had worn at the time. This earns him Penelope's respect. Some things, he says, are true. And she says, stranger, while before this you had my pity, you shall now be my friend and be respected here in the palace. But Odysseus in disguise presses on and says, I say to you without deception, without disguise, that I have heard of the present homecoming of Odysseus. Oh, if only this were true, Penelope says. You would be sent on your way with full honor, but alas, quotes, there are none left in the household to give orders, such as Odysseus was among men, if he ever existed. If he ever existed. Is this irony? Since to the audience, Odysseus is right in front of Penelope. Is she unconsciously asking him to unveil himself, remove his disguise? Does she suspect something, or is her mind wandering? She decides he needs a bath if he is to appear as a guest the following day. He says that only some old and virtuous woman should do it. So Penelope appoints his old nurse, Eurycleia, to the task. There is then a marvelous scene when she looks at the old man and says how like Odysseus is in build, and how the real Odysseus must even now be suffering in much the same way as the beggar in front of her. She recognizes an old scar on his leg, and Odysseus has to clamp his hand over her mouth in order for her not to say anything, not to give the game away. Of course, it's not a game. Odysseus is testing his wife, and the timing of any disclosure he makes is crucial to his success against the suitors. Anyway, after his bath, Penelope again sits with the disguised Odysseus. "Friend," she says, "I will stay here and talk to you, just for a little. To be sure, it will soon be time for sweet rest, for one delicious sleep takes hold of, although he may be sorrowful." Note the play of sinking from reality here. She asks him to interpret a dream she's had. This is now in the intimacy of the night. In the dream, she says, an eagle swooped down and killed all the geese she kept in her courtyard. But the eagle then perched on a roof and in a human voice said, "Do not fear, this is no dream, but a blessing real as day. You will see it done. The geese are the suitors, and I, the eagle, am your own husband come home, and I shall inflict shameless destruction on all the suitors." This is Penelope recounting a dream, foretelling Odysseus' return to Odysseus in disguise, who is sitting right in front of her. What does he say in reply? "Lady," he says, "it is impossible to read this dream and avoid it by turning another way, since Odysseus himself has told you its meaning, how it will end. The suitor's doom is imminent." So now there's a triple conjunction. Odysseus in the dream as an eagle, foretelling to Penelope the imminent return of the real Odysseus and the suitor's destruction. The real Odysseus in disguise as a wanderer, telling her the same thing. And Odysseus in disguise interpreting the meaning of the dreamt Odysseus' prophecy. Is this Homer sending us all up? Or does it signify the intangibility of truth, the ease with which the proper order of reality can be veiled and from which one can wander? Penelope will have none of this. In any event, these are words, not deeds. She says dreams come out of one of two gates. Deceptive dreams that never come true come out of the gate of ivory, while those that do come true come out of the gate of horn. And she's afraid that this dream came out of the gate of ivory. Is untrue. Anyway, with only disguised reality and dreamt truth, what can she do? The real Odysseus has not actually revealed himself nor killed the suitors. So Odysseus in disguise goes to sleep in the hall, and she sleeps in her chamber. He lies awake, wondering how the following day will turn out and how he's going to avoid the suitors' revenge after he's killed the suitors, if he manages. But Athene comes to reassure him and sends him to sleep. At the moment he falls asleep, Penelope in her room wakes up. She cries a little and prays to the goddess Artemis that she can die so that she can meet Odysseus in death rather than have to marry one of the infernal suitors. But then she checks herself and says, any evil is endurable, for there's always sleep. And quotes, with sleep comes oblivion, both good and evil. With sleep come dreams, This very night, she says, there was one who lay by me, like him as he was when he went with the army, so that my own heart was happy. I thought it was no dream, but a waking reality. So I hope you get the idea. When the story is reaching its climax with the bow contest, when the suitor's wrongdoing will finally be punished, order restored, and Odysseus will throw off his disguise and reveal himself, no longer as a wandering nobody, but as a hero who has succeeded by using cunning intelligence rather than simple force. There is a long play on Penelope's bewilderment as a metaphor for the bewilderment of mortals in distinguishing a true path from a false one. Dreams, waking visions, sleep, death. Is he really and truly dead? After all the deception I successfully practiced putting them off? Truth, when it comes, is hard to recognize. After the suitors have been killed, Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope as he really is. But she still can't accept reality, not until she has tested him about the marriage bed. And in this test, Homer himself has a last trick up his sleeve. Penelope has to test whether the person in front of her, now no longer a beggar in rags but properly bathed and spruced up by Athene, is really her husband. Come now, she says to a maid, make up our bed in the chamber outside 1 minute. What? Exclaims Odysseus in real anger. Who has moved the bed that I made on an olive tree? Which can't be moved. In this test, Penelope outsmarts the master of cunning, Odysseus, and Homer in turn outsmarts us, listeners or readers. For unexpectedly we see that Penelope is more than a match for Odysseus in cunning intelligence or metis. Husband and wife are thus truly alike in mind, as Odysseus had said is the ideal. Weaving a design with the wandering beggar, who is Odysseus in disguise, telling so many stories about the real Odysseus, none of which are likely to be believed. What is Homer saying about his own art, the creation of fame, legend, immortality, truth? Thank you.